welcome to this third episode of this new podcast on body politics in the 21st century. The Cambridge Centre for International Research has given me the great and challenging task of exploring what we do to our bodies, why we do it, and who decides what's beautiful, healthy, or wrong about them. And in the 6 episodes of this podcast, I will explore topics ranging from body positivity to self-tracking to plastic surgery. And in each episode, I welcome a different expert and scholar, and we chat about the politics of bodies in our contemporary world. And today, I'm really happy and grateful to welcome Dr. Lisa Smyth, who's a senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. And Lisa has written extensively on motherhood and parenting, on abortion, both in Ireland and Northern Ireland, as well as the more general concept of social roles. And for today's episode, I will question her about why, she came to do these research topics, how we should understand the very politicized nature of abortion and contemporary ideas of motherhood. So welcome, Lisa, and thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start off with a really general, but for me always really intriguing question, which is, what do you research and why do you research it? So what seems important about the kind of topics you do research on?
Okay, thanks, Ronja. I suppose I research social conflicts. That's my primary interest because of growing up through the intensity of the abortion conflict in Ireland in the 1980s and reaching adulthood at a time when abortion access had become extremely politicized, I suppose, and leaving Ireland at that point. So it had a personal significance for me. So I'm interested in these kinds of conflicts, those focused on abortion and other aspects of human reproduction, like motherhood, as you said, aspects of motherhood, particularly breastfeeding I've looked at a bit. More recently, I'm looking at caregivers in families, especially under the pandemic. So I find these to be important routes to understand social norms. So I'm interested in social conflicts around norms and the ways in which those kinds of conflicts can generate change. So I think these wide, broad social conflicts, often political conflicts, are actually experienced by human beings in very intimate ways, through our bodies, through our emotions, and in ways that can generate social change. So that's really the kind of range of things I'm interested in: conflicts, norms, emotional experience, and social change.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the link really is with norms and conflicts, and how this link re-emerges in different social conflicts. Who gets to decide which norms are prevalent, and who the norms apply to, but who has the power to enforce the norms, and how these two can diverge. And I think that's really apparent both in abortion and in family. So abortion and family, or motherhood more specifically, will be the 2 topics we'll discuss today. And we will start with abortion. But before we sort of, get into the more detailed discussion, just for, our listeners and for me as well, probably, I wanted to ask you if you could, give our listeners an overview of the current state of affairs regarding abortions in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Are the 2 the same? Are there similar policies? What has happened? Because a lot has happened in the past couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I suppose everyone knows that the Republic of Ireland has repealed its constitutional ban on abortion in 2018 after decades of conflict and struggle around that. So that created some momentum around Northern Ireland, which is often treated as a kind of a place apart, a separate and different exceptional place, which often gets forgotten because it's not a state. It's a part of a much bigger state, and it's a contested place, and anyone outside it is often a little bit reluctant to get involved because of the sense of specialness and sensitivity. So what's happened in Northern Ireland is a lot more messy and tricky than the simple story of what happened in the Republic. So we have a new legal framework in Northern Ireland, which was due to take effect this day last year, in fact, 31st of March 2020, which was introduced by Westminster. So although abortion was a devolved issue, when the local assembly collapsed, storm into effect, Westminster eventually decided to push through the decriminalisation of abortion. So that did happen in October 2019. And officially now, abortion is available in Northern Ireland during the first 12 weeks of a pregnancy, generally speaking. So that, in that sense, it's the same as the Republic of Ireland. And then in the north, you can access abortion up to 24 weeks, where there is a risk of injury to the physical or mental health of a pregnant woman or pregnant girl. And you can access abortion without a time limit for fatal fetal abnormality or severe fetal abnormality. So it's roughly similar to what's happened in the Republic. In the Republic, the rules are slightly more restrictive. But the big difference is that in Northern Ireland, the Department of Health, the Government Department of Health, which is responsible for providing the service, has refused to commission abortion services,
right,
for various legal reasons, saying that this is a complex issue which requires the executive to approve it. And while that has been going on, there have been cases going through courts again. And again, recently, this month, the UK government in Westminster again has taken over and decided to compel the Department of Health in Northern Ireland to implement abortion services, but it has created tremendous difficulty and suffering for women and girls in Northern Ireland trying to access abortion during this pandemic when travel has been so restricted.
Yeah.
So you have been able to get in somewhat patchy ways a medical abortion in Northern Ireland during the pandemic since last March, up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. But that has required attending a clinic during the pandemic twice, so it wasn't approved for telemedicine. It was a kind of, you had to go and see someone in person. And if you go beyond 10 weeks, then women have had to travel to England to access abortions that have still been funded by the UK government on the NHS. But even that has been a bleak experience from what I can gather, because where flights weren't available, sometimes cargo ships had to be used to get to England. And of course, hotels are closed, cafes are closed. There's a lot of hanging around on streets waiting for clinics to open. Yeah. So really, really dreadful circumstances and completely unnecessary, given that in legal terms, given that the law had been changed, but simply the services were not commissioned and the restrictions remained in place. So yes, a messy situation, which is very much overlaid with the politics of this region, the kind of the moral politics of political parties, and yeah, the intense opposition to implementing the rules. So for me, I suppose as a sociologist, I'm very interested in what's been happening in Northern Ireland, the kind of moral conflict going on here. So there's lots of evidence that public attitudes are quite liberal around abortion now. So we have survey evidence which shows, depending on the survey, roughly 70 to 80% of people here think abortion should be a woman's choice, at least in the first trimester. So there's general liberalisation in the population, but the political parties don't reflect that, and particularly the DUP and to maybe a lesser extent Sinn Féin. So the question is this a moral issue? Is it a religious issue? Or should the state treat it as a health and welfare issue? And that's where the conflict is going on, how to understand it. And of course, there's international bodies which are have very strong assertions about what should be happening here and around the world which are also being ignored to a certain extent by the local devolved assembly. So yeah, it's tricky and unclear, but hopefully it seems that things will get better now that Westminster has stepped in again.
So, I mean, there's so much that's interesting in that. To start with, just thinking about, you know, how many obstacles there still remain, even though legalization has taken place. So already, you know, with this really long path, you know, that has taken to get to legalization, and it seems you have this huge win, right? And of course you do. I don't want to minimize that in any way, but you have so many obstacles which follow after that. And, you know, as you rightly said, so much in the pandemic has made this even more complicated. And I don't think there's been, you know, a lot of news coverage or attention, you know, brought to this issue.
Absolutely. And yeah, Northern Ireland can't be the only place where women have not been able to access abortion care during the pandemic under lockdowns. It's a terrible thing to think about. I mean, Northern Ireland has often had some dreadful cases around abortion and the lack of access to abortion, which have not been widely reported at all. And it's just really interesting to me because similar cases, say in the Republic, get massive international attention.
Yeah.
And promote, you know, lots of soul searching by people in the society. And in Northern Ireland, when these kinds of cases happen, it just doesn't have the same kind of impact internationally. And I think it is very much about the kind of constitutional status of this place, that it's not a state. It's a kind of region of another state, and it's quite different to in this respect to Britain, to England, Wales, and Scotland. And it's just, you know, the story of Northern Ireland has always been the story of ethno-national conflict and the struggle for peace. And so women's struggles around reproductive rights, reproductive justice, reproductive health seem to very much have been treated as secondary. But I think, you know, if you look around the world, where struggles around reproduction are often hidden, and women's struggles and girls' struggles around, you know, sexual violence and sexual safety. Similarly, you know, it takes a particular type of story to emerge, to grab public interest, and to generate a reaction which creates change. So it's quite interesting to me to try and think about those differences, you know, why some stories become powerful drivers of change and other stories just disappear and don't do that. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that's so interesting. It's something which I like grapple a lot with in thinking about abortion, because I feel like that there's often what has the most pull is when you say someone should be able to access an abortion if they have been raped or they've been sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
You know, this has just, and especially if they're underage as well, it just has this natural pull. So I saw this BBC documentary, and the nurse in Liverpool where they had traveled to, you know, she talked about this 12-year-old girl having been raped, becoming pregnant and needing to travel to Liverpool, you know, paying a lot of money to access an abortion. And of course, this story is, you know, it has this immediate pull, and I think is really convincing. I also have this feeling that sometimes this is used, this undermines that there should be abortion, even if you haven't, at least in my opinion, if you haven't been raped and if you haven't been sexually assaulted, that there's something more fundamental to the access of abortion. And I feel like, you know, these stories have so much pull because they rely on some other moral principle rather than the one I would have liked to be accepted for abortion.
Yeah, I think that's so true. There's always the appeal to people's sense of compassion or empathy, for tragic cases which seem exceptional. And those kinds of cases are powerful for shifting people's thinking, that it's not a, it's not a simple, straightforward yes or no issue. It's very complicated. The morality of, thinking about what should and should not be legally acceptable. But yeah, there's a more basic point, which is about abortion being defined as a basic right, as sort of key, a key right which protects your right to life, which protects your health, which protects your mental health, and that the basic idea that women have not been treated and girls have not been treated as, as authorities, as moral decision makers over their own lives. So to me, it's not even about bodies. I mean, it is about bodies, but it's about bodies and a life. What sort of life, whose life is it, and how do you want to live, and how do you see yourself, and is this something that anyone can force on you? Can you be forced to remain pregnant under any circumstances and give birth?
Yeah.
And it seems that to make that argument, it just, it's much easier and much more appealing and sort of more politic to say, but what about cases of fatal fetal abnormality, or what about cases of rape, sexual assault? But there's an ordinary woman in the course of her life who just thinks, I can't deal with this pregnancy, and doesn't have to explain why. It's just, she just doesn't want to have this baby. It's just not what she's going to do. That argument is much more difficult to make. So I think it is really important that that the United Nations has declared abortion to be a basic right, a fundamental right, and similarly, the World Health Organization has defined abortion as essential healthcare. So in slightly different terms, but yeah, that this is a basic thing that is essential to your status as an equal person in a society, in a polity, someone who can make decisions, very difficult moral decisions often, or sometimes quite simple decisions about your own future, your own life, and the commitments that you're prepared to enter into, because it's not something easy or light. But yeah, it's always shocking to me to see how willing people are to insist on a woman going through with a pregnancy.
Yeah.
And to think that, well, whether or not she goes through with that pregnancy is not up to her. That seems, it's just an extraordinary idea, really, because pregnancy, motherhood, birth giving, these are life-changing experiences. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that there's a special politics involved in talking about abortion, specifically in Northern Ireland. So how do you think sort of Northern Ireland's case, or even Ireland's case, differs from other abortion discussions around the world? So the US or Poland at this moment in time has really prominent abortion discussions. And I'll take it there's a second question in there, which is, how is abortion, it seems, always very much linked to a more general politics, which is linked with it? Because you might think that, talking about a right to life, or a right to judge your own body and police your own body for women, seems detached from any sort of party or group politics, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. Well, I think everywhere is interesting and everywhere is different.
Yeah.
To some extent, but yes. Yeah, we all have kind of absolute attitudes to abortion, in a sense that, it's one of these morally contested issues which are never going to be resolved. It does tap into much deeper cultural beliefs about right and wrong, but I think more basically about gender. I think abortion taps into ideas about gender very directly, and about the family, about the position of women and girls in the family, and women and girls in the wider society, certainly in Ireland, north and south, it's been connected very centrally to ideas about the people. So it's kind of played a very big part in a kind of populist politics over many decades. In Ireland, in the Republic, that was very strong. It was very much about we the people. We the people resist those aliens. It was caught up in a kind of post-colonial effort to establish a successful state and a successful economy on the international stage. In Northern Ireland, obviously, it's a divided society. It has two peoples in a sense, if not three or more. So, and yet it has been still framed in this kind of populist language of we the people by those on the anti-abortion side. So it's very interesting, this effort to present a united front across otherwise, ethno-nationally divided populations, and claim that the moral perspective of that one anti-abortion perspective represents the whole society, and of course it doesn't. So, but I think you have to look at each society really carefully to see what work is abortion conflict or abortion politics doing in the culture. It seems to be very important in some places, like in the US. It seems to be a symbol of individual rights on the one hand, or a kind of very strong notion of gender inequality, gender subordination, patriarchy. So it's got this kind of symbolic power that other issues seem not to have, or to have less of. And perhaps in Poland it's the same, although again it's no doubt quite different in the shape that it's taken. So I think, yes, we like to, we do talk about abortion in moral terms, in this kind of universalist language, but the ways in which we understand it are so situated in our cultures, in our politics, in the dynamics of collective life. Cultural values are central. So it seems to get at all these much deeper things around our cultural values, really. Yeah, if that makes sense. So for me, I think you have to look one place at a time to see how it's playing out. Yeah, it's never just very straightforward.
Maybe to pick up on one specific example, I remember in one of your pieces on when the Eighth Amendment was repealed in Ireland, and you were thinking about what this could mean for Northern Ireland. You highlighted one aspect of pro-life or anti-abortion campaigns, which really struck me, which compared the killing of a fetus with the bloodshed and terror which had taken place in Northern Ireland. And for me, reading this, and of course not being from Northern Ireland, or not having a cultural connection with Northern Ireland, this seemed just such an overstretch and so clearly unconnected and incomparable, really. So how does this reference make sense culturally? How does it have pull and force, and why did they choose to employ this comparison?
I think it's it's the sort of it's really there's lots of ironies in this kind of form of politics. I think it's kind of a way of trying to frame abortion as deeply, deeply evil, a form of murder, and a form of murder, a murderous assault on a people. So it's presented by anti-abortionists in Northern Ireland as a kind of, reflecting a history of terror, a history of, and it's pulling people together through the language of we are peaceful, we are good people, and we do not do these evil, bad things, which may have happened here in our past. But we're calling people to arms, using what is in fact quite warlike language in itself. You know, the warlike imagery. There's anti-abortion. Everyone knows anti-abortion imagery is often quite bloody. It's often, you know, very saturated with, you know, images of death and murder and blood, and at the same time is framed as, you know, the moral crusade, the struggle for peace and a better world, and the struggle to be morally unique. So it's a really, it's just really interesting. It's this, again, I think it's a kind of populism, but it's also embedded in this war language, war imagery, the good fight. We must fight the good fight. We must protect ourselves against this kind of alien incursion. And abortion is often presented as a kind of genocidal attack, which is supported by capitalism. You know, it's another form. Capitalism as devaluing human life and devaluing human relationships and love and care and motherhood and all of this sort of thing. But it's presented in these apocalyptic terms. I think it does resonate with the history of this place, which has been through, you know, quite apocalyptic times in a sense. So, you know, there's an immediacy to this kind of a way of presenting it. This is a return to the worst times in our history, and we are not these people. We will do better. We will fight against this. And it's a kind of another, like a cultural, presented as a kind of cultural recolonization, but by these forces of evil, which are characterized as abortionists. Yeah, so it's, I suppose, an effort to distinguish us and them, and they are disgusting and horrific and murderous, and we are good defenders of right and defenders of the weak, because the fetus is often presented as the weakest of the humans, the most vulnerable, the one who doesn't have a voice. So yeah, it's got this very peculiar shape here. Yeah, but I think you can find this kind of thing in the US as well. So there's you know, there's stuff about abortion as being genocidal in the US, being racist, because it's mostly, you know, it's mostly found amongst Black or ethnic minority people. And so the idea is that they're being manipulated, caught up in this murderous industry, and they're being wiped out because there's all these minority ethnic people and non-white people and Black people in the US who were never born because of abortion. And so, yeah, it's not unique to this society, but it is a very powerful kind of form of policy, a powerful campaign, very simple, image-led and crusade-oriented campaign. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I remember seeing protests in the US in front of, you know, abortion and family planning clinics, which made real performances with blood or red, you know, blood-like fluids, and there were these, like, you know, babies, you know, like toy babies, painted red, and then they were thrown at the women who came out of these abortion and family planning clinics. And of course, this is, you know, as you say, a really powerful and disturbing imagery, but it is also very, very simple. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned at the start when we talked about abortions during a pandemic. So this traveling for abortions, which of course makes access really hard and expensive. And when I thought about that, and I think it comes up more and more in the kind of argument people make, which is abortions happen nevertheless, they just don't happen safely if you don't allow them, right? Because only those who can afford or have the time or can conceal that they will travel for abortions can access them somewhat safely. And I wonder how there's this link between abortion and sort of migration and the politics of migration and travel, which hasn't really been explored. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Not a huge amount. I mean, I think there are arguments out there that this is a form of becoming temporarily stateless, when you find that in order to protect your own life or your health, or to make to have a sense of autonomy over your life, that you have to leave your own country and seek refuge effectively elsewhere and hope that you'll find it. But you can only do that if you can afford it. So yeah, there's lots of historical stuff about how when air travel became more affordable, it became easier for women to leave countries like Ireland or Spain at the time to travel to more liberal places where abortion could be more easily accessed. So Britain was one of those destinations. So yeah, I mean, the economy plays a huge role in whether or not you can effectively become temporarily stateless and find a solution to your struggles in another place, and then returning with usually in silence, or you lie or you cover up, and because you can't talk about it, because certainly in Ireland you couldn't talk about it until very recently, because it was so shameful. It was regarded as very much the opposite of what a good Irish woman or a good Irish girl or a good Irish family member would do. It was the epitome of evil, and it was abhorrent. So yeah, I think it's very telling, about the position of women and girls in a society where, when it comes to the crunch, if you find yourself to be pregnant and want to end that pregnancy for whatever reason, that you might actually have to leave your own country and go somewhere else, just to not to have a baby against your will, or not to have a baby that might not be able to live, or whatever the circumstances are. It's so complex, the whole range of circumstances within which these decisions get made. It's not just that you're a rape victim, as you said before, although also you could be a rape victim. So it's it's very telling about the position, about the power of gender in societies where that is expected to happen. Women are not able to make decisions about their lives and their bodies without kind of becoming temporarily stateless and traveling. Or even, in the US, where women have to travel within the US large distances to access abortion services, you're not necessarily becoming stateless, but you are having to leave home, make sorts of complicated arrangements if you have other children or whatever it might be, leave work or whatever, that you can't just do it in the, within the frame of your own life. You have to step outside your own life and go somewhere and become a tourist, or whatever sort of way you could describe it. Become detached from your world temporarily, and that in order to be able to return to it and live in that world on your own terms to some extent.
Yes, I agree. I mean, again, in that BBC documentary, the nurse they interviewed in the Liverpool hospital, she said not a single woman who had come to a hospital would change her mind during the procedure. None of them didn't follow through. And I think you can easily see why this would be the case, because there's so much work, in addition to the mental load and pain, both physically and mentally you already bear, which you wouldn't take on if you know if you weren't certain this is what you wanted to do.
No, it's not an easy option at all, and certainly not when you have to travel. So you're already in by the time you've gotten there. You're well into the process. You're way past the decision. So the idea that you could just be persuaded at the door because someone's protesting there, and suddenly I realize maybe I shouldn't do this. It's quite disrespectful to the moral capacity of women and girls who are making those decisions. I think it has to be respected that those are serious decisions that have not just been arrived at in the blink of an eye, and particularly anyone who's traveled has gone to some lengths to try and follow through.
I very much agree with this point. They interviewed one young woman in the pro-abortion rally, and she suggested that it had often been, raised with her that abortion would become a form of contraception, and I find that just utterly incomprehensible. I mean, it just, as you say, it robs women of this moral capacity. It diminishes the pain that abortion causes for anyone. And I found that really, really striking and unbelievable, really.
I mean, it can become a form of contraception in societies where contraception is not easily available. But abortion is. So, again, you have to look up close at each place to see how it works. But the idea that it's a casual act, which women don't think about very carefully and just leap into it. These kinds of ideas were very strong in the Irish context. The idea that women and girls might want to have abortions because they conflicted with the holiday that you've booked, and the most disrespectful attitude towards these kinds of decisions was very prominent in public talk for many years, which is just, it's very telling about the status of women, I think.
Yes, and I think it's a really important point which you raised earlier, which is to really think about the gender politics of this. I want to move on to the sort of second big topic we have for this. Of course, a bit of a break, but as you said at the start, there are links between the two. So you've done a lot of work recently on social roles and specifically roles in the family. And you highlight, and I think many of us can see that the family has changed a lot over the past decades. And for one thing, you say that many people think that it's become de-institutionalized. So what does this mean, and what fundamental ways has the family changed over the past couple of years and decades?
This is kind of a debate in sociology. So it's the idea that families are kind of free places that we make up, that we can invent in whatever way we like. So it's a way of trying to explain the shift from, a very tight notion of what a family is, which is, male head of household, female subordinate, and children, and perhaps some extended family members, to our context where people count their pets as members of the family, and marriage has been really disconnected from reproduction. It's not shameful to have children outside of marriage. Divorce is perfectly acceptable, and in fact is often regarded as a good choice when the relationship is broken down. So we have very different expectations today about families, and of course blended families, lone parents, non-heterosexual parents, the whole range, lots of different ways of forming families today. And so in sociology, there's been a kind of an argument about, well, does this mean that the family is no longer an important institution in our society? And there's a fairly high level of acceptance of that idea that the family is no longer a social institution, but is in fact a matter of invention, reinvention, and creation. But for me, I think social institutions are really, broadly speaking, defined as where we have patterns of expectation around how we should act and how we should relate to each other. So I think if we abandon the idea that the family is an institution, we lose that, and it becomes a sort of free-for-all, and we lose the sense, which many of us have felt very strongly under the pandemic, that we have special obligations to family members. So we have obligations to provide care or duty. Now, we might not like, these are not often obligations that we've chosen. So we have a feeling, we have a sense that there is a kind of moral demand on us to respond to family members in particular ways, which we don't feel that moral demand to respond to our friends, unless we've really formally incorporated our friends into our families. So, you know, people caring for family members under the pandemic, maybe caring for people that they haven't chosen to care for, maybe they don't like them, maybe they even hate them. There's lots of peculiar households, I think, been formed and sustained under the pandemic. And I think if it was someone who was not kind of recognizable as a family member, you would feel much easier, you find much easier to walk away and to ask them to find some other source of support. So it's this kind of moral pull that family has on us, regardless of whether we've chosen it or not, whether we like it or not, and whether we even might choose to reject that sense of obligation because we really think this family member is a despicable person or something, and you know, it doesn't deserve our. But the way that we respond to this perception of family obligation also shapes our sense of ourselves. So do we think we're a good person or not because we've been good to our mother or our aunt or our cousin in a time of need, and you would have a justification in your mind for why I did or didn't do that. So I think there are still expectations which are caught up around family life. I think they're very much looser than they have been in the past, and there is much more scope for individual interpretation of those obligations and individual responses, but they're still there. They haven't gone away. So we're not living in patriarchy anymore, but we still do seem to have a sense of what a family member is as distinct to a non-family member, and that is often about the provision of care, and it's often about intergenerational care. The sense that, well, one of us has to do it. Who's going to? One of us in this group, which we call family. And it's maybe I haven't invented this relationship, I haven't chosen it, but I feel somehow caught up in the responsibilities. Yeah. So that's why I think in the idea, I think we have to be careful when we say that the family is no longer a social institution. We're not able to understand the demands that family roles make on us. I think you can see this very sharply in motherhood. The idea of mothers as primarily responsible for children, for childcare. And again, the pandemic has so strongly underlined this. Even when mothers struggle to share equally care and housework with, say, with fathers or other men in the household, there's lots of evidence, lots of survey evidence showing that that mothers have borne the burden of that, and that mothers have also been disproportionately furloughed from work because employers expect them to be bearing the burden of homeschooling and childcare. So it's a very strong normative expectation that having this certain position in a family, a role in a family, carries specific moral obligations which have to be somehow responded to in some way or another, and shape your your social experience and your attitude to yourself as you cope with that, with those demands.
I think it's so interesting, because I think you really brought out really well how we have these sort of conflicting attitudes to family. So if I think of myself, right, on the one hand, I have this really individualistic notion of myself that, at the end of the day, I can choose who I want to be around with. And if I'm not like financially dependent in any way, really, I decide who is my family. But I think you rightly pointed out, especially during this pandemic, you still do have this pull by this institution, and it's not as easy as you just choosing who you care about and who you don't, and who you feel an obligation to and who you don't feel an obligation to. And like in my very personal case, it has taken me, like, if I think back how much effort and time it has taken me to, for example, not view my father anymore as part of my family, because we didn't have a very good relationship, and I didn't want him to be part of what I consider family anymore. If I think back how much time and effort it took, and how many obligations that you yourself really strongly feel you have to counter, and how many times people ask you if, after all, you should forgive each other. I think that's, it's really, you really nicely point out that it's still there, right? No matter how much you think that it's after all just you, and you choose who you are around.
Yeah.
It's much more complicated than that, I think.
Yeah, it is really complicated. It's just that sense that you have to somehow respond.
Yeah.
There's a response required, whatever it might be. And if you want your response to be heard, you have to frame it in a way that makes sense to those that you speak to, and it makes sense in your, in the context of your culture, the norms that are powerful in that culture. And individual choice is a very powerful norm in our culture, in this place and time, in the global north. So it goes so far, but it's not the only norm out there, and there are others. And so we have to kind of put our responses together through the kind of navigate through the normative landscape to be understood and to feel good about ourselves, to not feel ashamed, but to not feel anxious. These kinds of emotions are very, very much indicating our sense of where we stand in the social landscape too. So yeah. That's what, yeah. So anyway.
How powerful do you think is the law in deciding who counts as family? So do you think that, like tax brackets or legal marriage documents, or even in a pandemic, who counts as a household? How much do you think how strong is the influence of this on our perception of what is a family?
Yeah, I think law is important. I think tax brackets are important, but I think these are not all that matters. So I think all of our institutions are very important in circulating ideas about who is a family and who isn't. And I think popular culture we can treat as a social institution, which also very, very much circulates norms and, provides us with stories about what a family is and what a family isn't. So I think you have to look across all of our institutions and see what's going on. And often the law is behind, cultural change, where people have shifted a bit, and it takes laws a while to be revised to reflect new expectations about family life. So I think it's a big question that you're asking, and I think it's about the whole of a society, all the elements, and individuals are part of that too. The ways in which we, as individuals, kind of reproduce the normative expectations of our context as we understand them, or we might resist them, and we might change them, we might revise them somehow, and it depends on how much power we have, that our interpretations might not go anywhere, might make no sense, and you might just be regarded as a very strange person, or you might be regarded as someone on the cutting edge who's doing interesting things with reinventing notions of family. So yeah, so I think it's a big complex process through which these ideas shift and change over time.
You mentioned motherhood earlier, and maybe more specifically what we think makes a good or bad mother. I think you argue in one of your papers that we have these legal provisions like equal parenting allowances and equal parental leave, for example. But what's needed, I think you say there, for real equality or dignity in family life and child rearing is to look at this idea of motherhood and good motherhood. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the ways in which gender norms continue to be powerful beneath the surface of legal change, so or policy change. So we might have important policy innovations around, flexible work or parental leave, shared parental leave. These are all really crucial, really important changes. But you can there's always really interesting research around which looks at the difference it makes in organizations if a woman asks for flexible working conditions as opposed to a man, or if a woman takes leave as opposed to a man. So gender continues to operate all the time underneath these policies, and so it's not just a matter of improving our coordination in the workplace between parents and non-parents, or between women and men, or whoever. It's more about changing the underlying normative expectations of women and men to promote equality, so that it's not all women who get furloughed during a pandemic, are not disproportionately women, or not disproportionately women who are expected to do the homeschooling or the cooking or whatever it might be. It's always so much more intangible, the kind of normative underpinnings of how policies get taken up and how they work, and the social response to someone asking for flexibility. You might get the flexibility, but you might never get promoted in the future, or your colleagues might think that you're not very competent because your heart isn't in the job. Again, it depends on the norms shaping the work environment in the society. So, it's just so complex and so deep, the ways in which these kinds of policies actually play out, which is not to say that they're not important. They're crucially important, and they can also, if they work well, they can also contribute to normative change, underlying normative change. But it's kind of not one thing or the other. It's both. You need both. Yeah.
And
improve.
Where do you think we pick up these norms, basically? So, of course, all sorts of gender norms, but maybe like motherhood norms more specifically. Is this something where we take, you think, a lot from our parents and how they raised us, or is it, what are kind of influences? And I guess with that, where could we try to change, norms we would like to see changed?
Yeah, I don't think we simply pick up norms about motherhood from our own mothers, because we often have conflict with our mothers about how they mothered. The whole psychoanalysis industry is based on that. And we often think that we are reinventing how to mother ourselves in this individualistic, way. So I think, again, it's about our situation, where we are in a society, what our position is, who we encounter, and the norms of the wider society come to shape roles like motherhood, which are, in a sense, these are ancient sort of roles in some sense, but we have the norms of capitalism very much shaping norms of motherhood. So the idea that we should be maybe efficient, and we should actively choose motherhood, and we should have goals around it, and seek to maximize our effort with our children so that they maximize their talents, and that we maybe maintain our family's social status through the education that we provide for our children and the lives that we have ambitions for them to have. So all this kind of these wider norms, say from the labor market, from the economy, can move into the family and shape how we apprehend those roles. In motherhood, I think there's also a very strong strand of a kind of romantic norm about self creation and self-discovery through the role. So it's, again, there's not one single way to be a mother. There's lots of conflict over what it means and how to do it well and how to feel good about that. The norms are not simply limited to the family. They're much broader. They go beyond the family, and there's a constant dynamic process where norms get revised, edited, if you like, and revised over time, and connected up in all sorts of surprising ways, in surprising roles, where motherhood still is also shaped by a norm of self-sacrifice, a very strong gender norm there. And some women resent that and resist that, and others embrace it. So it's so complex how that works. And I don't know how you simply change it. I don't think there's one simple answer to that question. I think, again, these are dynamics that go across the whole society, across the globe. We pick up because we're all, caught up in the global popular culture world as much as anything. So how we think about motherhood and how we think about family, how we think about gender, I think it depends on the ever-growing strength of norms of equality and the ways that those norms might ultimately undo norms of gender subordination or gender inequality. But it's not a simple, straightforward process, I don't think. But yeah, states and laws are really crucial too.
Yeah, and I mean, what you mentioned about complexity and conflict, I think it already shows, in how even ideals of motherhood are often incompatible, conflicting, or at least really hard to realize. So you ought to, still be your own woman, you ought to work and be an individual, but you also ought to give every time and all the care in the world to your children. You ought to care about them, but not be overbearing. So, partly I think this just speaks to a gendered idea of just expecting women to, or the very conflicting general gender ideals we have, which are then played out, I guess, in the motherhood space, which is taken to be so fundamental to femininity and womanhood, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really complex. I think, gender difference, ideas about basic gender difference really do sit side by side with ideas about equality and individual freedom. In motherhood, that's very clear. And the question, and it's just, I think it's just going to be like that for a while. I mean, there are some societies that seem to have equality as the strongest norm and gender as a weaker one. But in many societies, that's not the case. It's a struggle. Sometimes gender is the stronger one, the stronger norm, and equality is quite weak. And again, even within a society, where you are in that society, what your class position is, your race, ethnicity, whatever, all the differences that we have in society shape the ways in which you apprehend these norms and how they apprehend you, and how you think, how you struggle to be a good mother in this context. It's you're just trying to navigate the complex normative landscape and the kind of resources you've got at your disposal at the same time. So it is really complex, and the reasons why equality might become the strongest norm in a society are also complex, and laws are important in that, but also culture. and the ways in which we live our lives. So comparative research can be very illuminating on all these kinds of questions, I think. Yeah.
I think this is a really good place to end on, and we've kind of exhausted our time, but I just want to thank you for a really, really great interview. And I think, both topics we talked about are extremely of such importance, at this point in time. And, I want to thank you for coming on, sharing your knowledge and your work and research with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for all your questions, really interesting questions, and I appreciate it. The opportunity to talk through all this material. So thanks again.